giving this multi-layered interpretation to the Mahabharata is one of the unique attributes or the contributions of Sri Madhvacharya. Mahabharata is the greatest text, even surpassing the Vedas. So the illusion is only at that level, but all that you are experiencing is still real. So when we say external world, it is not just about what is out there in the physical world. It's also about your mental world. Don't consider that guy as a Vishnu Bhakta who is behind mere material progress and is looking after, is very greedy, is excessively indulging in money, artha drishna, and is Shatamati, who says one thing, does the other. There is this hypocrisy in his behavior.
Sri Madhvacharya also has posited to us through his works that Bhagvat Geeta really has the explanation for almost everything that comes, be it in philosophical debates or the Sanatana thought, and it is essentially the theory for everything. Namaste. Welcome to this second episode in our tripartite series on Sri Madhvacharya's Tattvavada school of Vedanta. In the previous session, the first in this three-part series, we had done an introduction of Sri Madhvacharya's approach and episteme, the different schools of thought or Darshanas in the Indic philosophy were introduced. And here we located Sri Madhvacharya's approach of Tattvavada and how it was unique. We also briefly discussed the epistemological tools that were provided by him to understand the world, and most importantly, what makes these tools of inquiry valid and legitimate. In this episode, we will be unpacking some of Sri Madhva's tenets. So, welcome. Namaste, Srinidhi ji.
Namaste.
Thank you so much, Dhanyavada, for joining us in this
My pleasure.
Second episode. So, let us begin by taking up one of the reactions to our previous conversation. Does it make sense when people say that the darshanas ought to be integrated rather than delineated?
Okay, so let me begin with a Mangalacharana verse. Vyasaya bhavanashaya shrishaya gunarashaye hridyaya shuddha vidyaya madhvaya cha namo namaha. That's a very interesting question, Saritaji. I guess it may be coming from 2-3 different perspectives. Why such a question on why do we need to delineate, why can't integrate the darshanas? Perhaps it's a socio-political or a cultural reaction in a sense, in the way, well, as a civilization, we have multiple approaches or multiple perspectives to look at a question or a school of thought or an idea. So why do we need to get into the details of the differences? Just get an overall perspective as to, okay, what is the Indic overall vision towards a problem, which is surely a legitimate way of looking at it. But I guess there is a problem of flattening of diversity in that process. So in a way, the continuity or the vitality of a civilizational discourse is also due to the multiplicity and diversity that it holds and carries. I mean, if you look at, let's say, even within the Madhvacharya's darshana, there are multiple sampradayas due to different teachers or the family traditions in terms of what exactly do you practice in particular way. While there may be one common frame of the philosophical tenets, there would still be differences in the ritualistic practices or how the daily life would unfold in particular families. That does not contradict the uniformity at one level of the school of thought. And if you abstract that further, it can then be seen that, well, there are multiple approaches that each darshanas or schools of thought are providing, but there is another common element. For example, the Mimamsa or the Vedanta darshana as one approach, and within that you have multiple schools. And then you can abstract that even further to say that, well, there are views that look at the Vedic thoughts from different perspectives that we discussed for the darshanas, but they are all coming from one idea of the fundamental Vedic view on the world and the happenings in general. And you can abstract that even further to say, well, there are believers and non-believers, not necessarily from the Vedic worldview. So that's also a legitimate categorization. So I guess the question of delineation or integration is more of a level of abstraction that one is interested in. Okay. So depends on the detail that a seeker is interested in. But that doesn't mean that the diversity as a reality would vanish if we ignore to look at the details. So I guess it's more a question of, as I said, the interest of the seeker, the amount of engagement that one is intending to have with a particular idea. So if we are comfortable with one an approximation, we may be okay to look at it, but I don't think so. So therefore, my fundamental point is these different approaches do not necessarily mean any social or cultural kind of dichotomy or unease. It is possible to look at them as levels of abstraction or detail that one is interested in. And it also perhaps from the second perspective adds to the rigor of philosophical debates. So when there are multiple views, you actually seriously engage on what would be the kind of truths that I can rigorously try to uncover. So in that sense, I don't think that delineation and integration should be kind of a worry. It's just a function of how much of abstraction that we are interested in and how much of detail that we are particularly looking for.
Right. So also from the first session, you had mentioned that Madhvacharya was the first serious Bhashyakara to have written extensively on Ramayana, Mahabharata and the Bhagavata. So did no one write about these texts before him, one? And secondly, what was unique about Sri Madhvacharya's writing about them?
Oh, okay. So obviously, I mean, people had written. I mean, he wasn't the first to write. There were multiple commentaries and traditional explorations on Mahabharata and Ramayana, the Bhagavata and such. But the point when we focused on Madhvacharya as the first serious Bhashyakara, what I meant was that you had these Vedanta schools of thought that are focusing on the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita, kind of what in the contemporary or the modern world people call as spirituality or the essence of all the textual material, and those were largely the objects of attention for the Vedanta schools. What Madhvacharya did was, coming from that particular approach, which is the Vedanta approach, he found a way to integrate the Mahabharata, Ramayana, Bhagavata or the Itihasa Purana corpus within the Vedantic idea of looking at the world. So as a rigorous Bhashyakara of the Brahma Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita and such, he was arguably the first to comment on the Mahabharata, Ramayana corpus. So in that sense, he was the first, not to say that there weren't any commentators earlier, but coming from the Vedanta perspective and still keeping an important role for the Mahabharata corpus or the Itihasa Purana corpus is something that is unique in Madhvacharya's approach. So what is unique about his writings was your second question on Mahabharata, Ramayana, etc. There are multiple things. In fact, I mean, just to give you a gross idea, amongst all of his works, one huge work, kind of magnum opus of his compositions, is the Mahabharata Tatparya Nirnaya. So, running for about 5,000 plus verses. So, in that sense, the major work that he wrote was on the Mahabharata. And there is an extensive commentary written directly on the Bhagavata called Bhagavata Tatparya. That's also unique and is pretty huge in that sense. The details that he focuses on in these works is very interesting. So, for example, there is a general understanding, especially in some corners of the Indian knowledge systems traditions, especially when countered with the modern narratives on history and the Indic narratives on Itihasa, to in some sense say that, well, our Itihasa Purana approach is different from your history approach of finding facts. So, we may have, this is one story, Bhagavata is telling, Mahabharata is telling a different story, Vishnu Purana is telling some other story, and if there are contradictions, it's fine, this is one person's view, this is another person's view. But this actually raises some fundamental questions, right? I mean, how can there be, I mean, if you are claiming that Mahabharata is indeed a real event, it can't be that one person is narrating one story in a factually different way than the other. So, Acharya takes these questions head on. So, for example, in the Mahabharata, there is a story after the war where Ashwathama is undertaking a mission on Duryodhana's request to basically, I mean, we know the story, right? I mean, he kills the Upapandavas,
right.
And then there is a fight between the Pandavas and Ashwathama. So, who actually defeats Ashwathama and takes the money? So, he had a money on his shiras, and so he takes that. So, who was the person who defeated him? So, Mahabharata says that it is Bhimasena, and Bhagavata says it is Arjuna. If you look at the contemporary commentaries, I mean, I'm not saying from the traditional worldview, but even in the contemporary discourses, people would say, well, so there are these multiple views, because these are anyway stories. So, so whatever has been passed on from one generation to the other, so whoever is continuing that story, there may be these differences. But Madhvacharya was very strict in these kinds of issues. So, he said, well, it can't be that it is both. I mean, there has to be one of the two that is true, factually true in that sense, because it's a factual story, that factual event that has happened. So, and he says, quoting from another text from a now unavailable part of the Skanda Purana, and he says, what the Bhagavata is narrating is a swapna, is what Ashwathama saw in his dream.
I see.
Whereas what Mahabharata is narrating was the actual event. So, there is no contradiction. So, even though Bhagavata is saying something, it does not, because I mean, these are stories that have actually happened in two different realms. Right. Ashwathama saw something in his swapna, and this is something that happened. So, I mean, if you don't get into these details, it actually raises the questions on validity of these texts. Well, we don't need to rely on the stories told here. So, Acharya was very particular in getting into these kinds of details also, which fundamentally establishes the validity of these texts at one level.
So, he resolved the discrepancies.
Correct.
And thereby made the understanding more rigorous.
Yes, yes.
Of the Itihasa Puranas.
Correct, and added the reliability
right.
To this corpus. Second, the way in which he looked at Mahabharata is perhaps, I mean, this is what, 800 years ago. So, he gave this very unique approach, drawing from one of the verses in the Mahabharata itself, which says that Mahabharata has 3 layers of looking at it. Manvadi kechid bruvate, asti kadi tathapare, tatha uparicharadi anye, is how the Mahabharata itself says. But not many knew what exactly these were. So, Mahabharata is saying, well, there is one layer that is at the level of Manu, the other, or the Manvadi, the other Astikadi, and the third Uparicharadi. And Acharya said, these are referring to 3 layers of interpreting the Mahabharata. He said one is the Astika framework, which is looking at the Kaurava Pandava, the storyline, the historical actual conflict and what happened, which is what we generally look for in the Mahabharata. And he said, well, there is another layer, which is the Mahabharata hinting at by calling it Manvadi, and Manu is referring to the Manas, or the inner conflict that happens. So the Kauravas and the Pandavas actually represent multiple individual, our mental faculty in a way, right? So Dharma is represented by Dharmaraja. Bhakti is represented, Bhakti, Jnana, and many more characteristics by Bhimasena. Shravana, Manana, Dhyana, the intent to listen, think about, and meditate, is represented by Arjuna. So Acharya gave a mapping to all these characters and the particular inner factors, and how a story can be looked at as a conflict between those good and bad behaviors or inclinations within one's mind. So Duryodhana, for example, is representing incorrect knowledge.
I see.
Draupadi is representing right knowledge. Shakuni is representing Nastikya, the atheism, or a kind of an approach. And you had people like Bhishma, Drona as our organs, which would tilt in the way whoever is controlling them.
Like he was under Duryodhana's control.
Correct,
so
correct.
That would be.
So they don't necessarily carry an inclination that was towards Duryodhana by default.
Right.
But because of the influence, there was a attraction towards one particular.
It was led by illusion, ignorance, and illusion.
Correct. So Duryodhana and Dushasana are doing that. So the whole of the Mahabharata can actually be read in this a psychological kind of conflict that's going on, and how any event that's being narrated is actually a metaphorical description of what might be happening within us. And Acharya said at a third level, that's even deeper level, is that it is Uparicharadi.
Yes.
That's represented. So Uparichara is Bhagavan Narayana. So the Upari refers to the one who is above all of these, or the controller. So that inner and the supreme being, as the idea, as the message from all these smaller stories, and how the Lord is playing that Antaryami, or the Niyamaka role everywhere, is also being narrated through the Mahabharata. So giving this multi-layered interpretation to the Mahabharata is one of the unique attributes or the contributions of Srimad Madhvacharya. One other thing that I have to mention is how Acharya kind of rediscovered the roles of Hanuman in Ramayana and Bhimasena in Mahabharata. I mean, if you look at the original Mahabharata with a greater attention, we actually see some phenomenal personality of Bhimasena, which is not known in the popular discourse. And Acharya gives a very focused attention to Bhimasena's role, and shows the kind of particular actions that he takes, and why they indicate a very deeply spiritual and a knowledgeable personality in Bhimasena. I mean, for example, the well-known episode of Yaksha Prashna, right? Where Yaksha is asking a question, and only if you answer, I'll allow you to take water from this reservoir, etc. So Acharya makes this important observation, that if you are claiming Bhimasena to be very knowledgeable, why wouldn't he, or why couldn't he answer the questions? And he says, well, he was actually following a higher order dharma, called where you don't use your vidya for your livelihood. Vidyopajivana is not to be undertaken. So here it was a question of, well, I won't allow you to drink water. So to make that happen, you have to kind of encash your knowledge. And Bhimasena says encashing knowledge is something that degrades your tejas, your inner spiritual power would get degraded. So a lot of these nuances on how the Mahabharata story unfolds and what this communicates to us as practitioners through these roles that Bhima enacted or such is what you see extensively in the Mahabharata Tatpara. Lots of these minor details and the explanations on that, while keeping the Vedantic frame intact. That this is not a a story for just a cultural without a deep philosophical spiritual insight, is not how Acharya presents it. This is a deeply philosophical and spiritual storyline. Therefore, when you look at this Manvadi and Uparicharadi as embedded in the Mahabharata storyline, so that opens up a very new perspective to looking at Mahabharata, which is what Acharya does.
And it enables a deeper understanding of the text itself.
Correct.
And understanding.
Correct. In fact, he goes on to say that Mahabharata is the greatest text, even surpassing the Vedas. So that's a very bold claim to make, that even the unauthored texts like the Vedas are of course considered epistemologically the first layer to enter. But Acharya argues that the Itihasa Purana texts are even more greater in their messages at multiple levels, even for the philosophical and spiritual pursuits.
So let's zoom in on certain aspects of Sri Madhva's Tattvavada moving forward. And it makes sense for us at this point, not only by way of rediscovering the richness of our traditional knowledge system, but also to address some of the misrepresented stereotypes of the Madhva Dvaita approach in our mainstream discourse, particularly as those who just wear the external Vaishnavite symbols, or who are preoccupied with rejection of Advaita, or as people who just make a fuzzy claim in realism versus spirituality debates. So to navigate through this confusion, is there a way to neatly but briefly capture what exactly is the philosophy of Sri Madhvacharya?
Sure. Before I answer that question, just to clarify, whether it is the Vaishnavite symbols or the rejection of Advaita, they are surely important. So, in fact, Acharya said that even the external symbols, but the problem would be when it is just those symbols without the details of the philosophy, which we will be discussing. They are practicing contrary to what Acharya is arguing as the Vaishnava school of thought. So then these symbols lose their significance, but the symbols do have significance even in Acharya's frame. Or whether it is the rejection of Advaita, of course, I mean, for a serious philosopher engaging in darshanic debates and discourses, as we have discussed in the previous session also, these debates were part of any school. So Acharya's school engaged with Advaita, Nastikya, Buddhism, and all the other schools that Acharya's school considered as not accurate according to his way of looking at it. So there were debates, and which is a continuing tradition. That's probably one of the a living and a rigorous tradition is actually the Dvaita debates even till date. So the rejection of Advaita is also one of the important tenets in his school, but as you probably meant, it was the preoccupation with only that, which is not what he wanted to argue in his overall school of thought. So coming back to your question on the if we can neatly summarize, what comes to my mind is a verse that is attributed to Sri Vyasatirtha. Some say that it was perhaps composed by his teacher Sri Padaraja, but the general consensus is that it is Sri Vyasatirtha. So, Sri Vyasatirtha was the Rajaguru of Krishna Devaraya, the well-known
Vijayanagara.
Yeah. So, and Sri Vyasatirtha is a very important personality in the Madhva tradition.
Yes.
For the Rajaguru, I mean, we know the impact that the Vijayanagara Empire had in bringing the civilizational ethos back to a great extent. Additionally, he was a great scholar, so wrote some of the, I mean, till now considered some, the great texts in the traditional curriculum in the Dvaita Vedanta field called Vyasatraya, Chandrika, Nyayamrita and Tarkatandava. Additionally, he was also one of the important saints who initiated Purandaradasa and Kanakadasa into the Haridasa Sahitya movement. So, and he himself composed a lot of Kannada songs in the Haridasa Sahitya literature. So, while writing these rigorous Samskrita texts, he was also engaging with the masses. Yeah,
yes.
So, through this Dasa Sahitya literature. And he is also credited to have installed 732 Hanuman temples across southern part of the country. So, and in many of those places, they're worshipped by the masses again in the villages. So, his vision to actually kind of make the teachings and the practices accessible to the masses is something extraordinary. He has apparently, as I said, there is some debate on whether it was Sri Vyasatirtha's work or his teacher Sri Padaraja's work, but in any case, so this verse, one verse, neatly captures some of the important tenets. This is not to say that this is containing all the tenets, but is a good starting point for us to think about what Srimad Madhvacharya is trying to say. So, Sriman Madhvamate Harih Parataraha. This actually lists 9 tenets.
Okay.
Harih Parataraha, Satyam Jagat Tattvataha. So, Harih Parataraha is essentially saying that Bhagavan Vishnu is the supreme entity. So, it is a Vaishnavite school, therefore, naturally Vishnu is the primary Parabrahman. So, Harih Parataraha, Satyam Jagat Tattvataha. This world is absolutely real. It is not just real at a apparent level or at an inferior level, it is real in the absolute sense. Satyam Jagat Tattvataha, Bhinna Jivaganaha. All the individual Jivatmas, in fact, there are sets of Jivatmas. All of them are different from each other, they are distinct. So, there is an individual unique identity to every one of us. So, every Jivatma is different from the other Jivatma and naturally from the other material object. So, in a sense, this is alluding to what Sri Madhvacharya has conceptualized as the Panchabheda philosophy, that there is a 5-fold difference. The difference between a Jivatman and another Jivatman, then the Jivatman and a material, the inanimate, the Jada object. So, the Jiva Jada, and then two Jada Padarthas are also different. Okay. So, one material is different from another material. So, that is 3. Then Bhagavan or the Ishvara. So, Jiva and Ishvara are different and Jada and Ishvara are different. So, there is this 5-fold Veda that Acharya talked about, and this is captured in a way that Bhinnaha Jivaganaha, all individual souls, some may not agree with the translation, but generally the Jivatmans are different from each other. Bhinna Jivaganaha Harehe Anucharaha. So, that is the 4th one. All of these Jivatmans are subordinate to Bhagavan Narayana. Harer Anucharaha Nichocha Bhavam Gataha. The 5th is that there is an internal and eternal hierarchy among the Jivatmans. So, so they are all subservient to Bhagavan Narayana and they are all distinct, but there is also a hierarchy within the Jivatmans that one is superior than the other. So, this ordering is also embedded in the system. So, that is 5. 6. Muktihi naija sukhanubhutihi. Moksha, or the liberation that we talk about, is nothing but experiencing one's own inner bliss. Naija sukha anubhuti. Basically, it was trying to clarify, because every school of thought was talking about moksha, but moksha was conceptualized differently from in different schools of thought. So, some argued that absence of sorrow is moksha. There is no bliss as a positive experience. Some said, an eternal upward journey is moksha. Some said identifying yourself as one with the Parabrahman is moksha. Some said identifying yourself as a part of the Parabrahman is moksha. So, there were different schools of thought. So, this is clarifying what Acharya meant by moksha. And this ties with the earlier idea of individual identity, that naija sukha is that every individual has an inner bliss of his or her own that is distinct again. So, experiencing what you originally and essentially are is that moksha. So, what is the path to reach there is Amalabhaktischa tat sadhanam, that is number 7. The uncontaminated pure devotion, and we may recollect the discussion we had about bhakti briefly in the last episode also, that this devotion is not blind following or an attachment. It is a combination of a rigorous knowledge, a conviction coming from that knowledge, and therefore an automatic attachment that one develops towards the object that you have understood to be of that great caliber. So, Mahatmya Jnana Purvaka Sneha. Sneha is this attachment, and you have this knowledge of greatness that naturally propels you towards the object. So, that is bhakti, and that bhakti is the only tool to reach moksha. So, that is number 7. Number 8, Akshadi Tritayam Pramanam, which we have also briefly touched upon in the last session, that there are 3 fundamental tools to know anything: Pratyaksha, Anumana and Aagama. The perception, logic and texts or words. Then the last one is actually an interesting one. Akhila Amnayayika Vedyo Harihi. How do you know the Lord? How do you realize the Lord? Because many of these things are essentially boiling down to, if you are interested in reaching to the state of moksha, you require bhakti, and bhakti requires knowledge, and knowledge should come from some source. So, how do you realize the nature of the Lord? So, Acharya said the only source are the texts. So, the significance of the Vedic corpus, or the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Bhagavad Gita, all of this comes in this, that all the words are essentially talking about the greatness of Bhagavan Vishnu, and they are the only source. So, that is interesting. So, all texts talk about the Lord, and it is only the texts that talk about the Lord. So, if you need to experience or realize, you have to go through this phase, and then when you appreciate the nature of the Paramatman, then through meditation and contemplation you can actually see inside that Parabrahma in you, and that develops into a deep form of bhakti, and then that leads you towards a path towards moksha. So, that is the broad kind of brief summary, but as I said, this can be actually developed into multiple more ideas. So, for example, one thing is, we said Bhagavan Vishnu is supreme, but Acharya also makes this point that all the incarnations of the Lord are one and the same. There is the exact opposite of the complete individual identity for the Jivatmans. When it comes to the Paramatma, all the avatars are one and the same. So, whether it is Rama, Krishna, Narasimha, Matsya, Kurma, Vedavyasa, many more, or the direct avatars, the incarnations of the Paramatman, are one and the same, with not a single quality being different.
And this is not limited to the Dashavataras.
No,
it
no,
is
all
avatars.
the Sakshat avatars of Bhagavan Vishnu, the direct incarnations of Lord. As I said, Vyasa is not part of the 10, but Acharya argues very strongly that Vedavyasa is a direct avatar of Bhagavan Vishnu, and there is not even, I mean, there is no amount of difference between Vyasa and Krishna or Parashurama or Rama. So, to your earlier question on what Mahabharata Tatparya Nirnaya or such texts actually talk about, are trying to resolve these conflicts also in the apparent stories. For example, Rama and Parashurama fight in the Ramayana.
Yes.
And the general understanding is Rama defeats Parashurama.
Yes.
And Acharya gives a clarification as to no, that's philosophically not tenable, and that's not what happened. So there is a backstory to that, and how do you understand this event? So Rama and Parashurama are one and the same. So these kinds of details are also what the text Mahabharata Tatparya talks about. But the idea that I was trying to refer to is that all the avatars are one and the same. These are some of the important tenets that this verse was trying to capture.
So let's start now with the tenets per se. The tenet that you mentioned that says that the external world is real, absolutely real. So how can we reconcile this when the world itself is not permanent and it is transient, it's subject to constant readjustment. So how I perceive could be different from how you perceive or somebody else perceives. So how can there be an absolute truth in all this?
Okay. This is perhaps one of the important ideas with which you started the previous session also on, the elephant. Yeah, right. So multiple perspectives on one object. So how can there be an absolute truth? I think one clarification we need to appreciate what Madhvacharya is suggesting here is that impermanence, incompleteness, and inaccuracy are three different ideas.
Okay.
Right? Something may be temporary. That doesn't make it a false entity. So we as individuals in this janma are temporary. That doesn't mean our existence for whatever number of years we are here, won't make it an untrue event. It's a true event. So truth, absolute or otherwise, has no relationship to the permanence of an object. So that's one of the, I would say, a category error that we are making when we try to equate permanence to truth.
Okay.
Sure, if we argue that is it a permanent truth, is this external world a permanent truth in the way it exists? Surely not. I mean, at every moment it is changing. So there is absolutely no permanence claimed here as it exists. In fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna calls this as Ashwatha. And Acharya explains that the word Ashwatha is basically referring to the fact that it is moving like an Ashwa, the horse, which is changing its position every moment, or which does not, so that which changes every next day. Shva is tomorrow in Sanskrit. So not tomorrow, not standing like what it is even tomorrow. That's the meaning of the word Ashwatha, another meaning. So of course the transientness or the change is accepted, but that does not mean that it is not true. So truth or the the satyatva has as we can easily hopefully relate to are two different entities. The Satyata is different from Nityata. So, Satya and Nitya are two different concepts. The second is about the, as you said, I perceive something, you perceive something else. And Acharya uses this interesting analogy. Pashyantopi na pashyanti mero rupam vipaschitaha. Just like a huge mountain, I mean, just like the elephant example, the traditional example is to take Meru Parvata. You know, the one that is, you can't comprehend the completeness of the Meru Parvata from one perspective. You have to look at it from different angles, and even then your vision may still be limited. But that doesn't mean that you haven't seen the Meru Parvata. So, what you have seen from this angle on this time stamped view is real. So, the idea is, the problem would be when you are claiming your perspective as the complete perspective, that's when you can argue that, well, you are being inaccurate. If you say, well, this is the only part of the Meru Parvata, and this is how it is, and there is no other angle to it, then there is a problem. So, incompleteness, when understood as incomplete, makes it accurate.
Right.
Right. Similarly, transience, when understood as different from the truth, does not contradict that there can be impermanent truths. So, this whole world is, of course, as it exists, won't continue in the same way, and that we are not perceiving the whole world completely. So, my perspective is equally valid than your perspective compared to your perspective. So, there is no, as long as our vision, our sense objects, our sense organs and our tools are reasonably accurate, there is no reason to not believe what the other person is also trying to say. So, multiple perspectives can still be part of absolute reality. So, I guess the incompleteness, inaccuracy and impermanence, when separated out, we would perhaps be able to appreciate what the absolute truth sense that Acharya was talking about. That it is not a relative truth. Relative truth would sometimes mean that, well, it may be true for me, not for you. Well, there is nothing of that sort. I mean, whatever is the time now is the time at this point in time, from this clock, from this standard. Of course, we need to specify all these things, but when all these are specified, then there is something that's absolute. So, that is what Acharya was getting at, and more importantly, it had a philosophical implication. That so, which then means that what you are experiencing is a true samsara. So, what you need to get rid of is a true problem that we are all in. So, this is not an illusion. I mean, the examples that some of the commentators provide is like a medical disease that someone is experiencing. So, we can equate this samsara to a disease, and you need to take a medicine to get yourself cured of this. That does not mean that you are not ill at all, or that your illness was an illusion, or that you are, so it's of course impermanent. I mean, you got cured of it, but the very fact that you got cured of it makes that illness a real illness. Right. So, that is the reality that Acharya was talking about. So, this world is real, this experience is real, and the suffering is real, and you need to get rid of this, and that's moksha. So, I need to also clarify what Acharya meant by reality. So, as I mentioned, it is different from incompleteness and impermanence. So, being inaccurate is what comes close to unreal. But what is real then? So, that which has no counter evidence to our experience. So, an object is experienced, and there is no reason to believe that it is wrong experience, and then that object becomes real in the ontological category. The second is if that has caused an effect for it to be called a real entity. So, an illusionary entity cannot cause a result. And all of this is, by the way, coming from the Bhagavad Gita characterization where Krishna says that calling the world unreal is a quote unquote bad thing. Asatyam apratishtamte jagadahuranishwaram. So while discussing good and bad, Krishna says calling this world unreal is not right. So Acharya is drawing from all of this and categorizing the world to be absolutely real.
So I have a counter question to that. What happens when I see a rope and I mistake it to be a snake and I run away?
Okay.
So how would that be treated?
Sure. So basically, there is an effect, but still the snake is untrue. I mean,
Yes.
this is a classic question in the traditional debates too. And Acharya takes this problem head on, and he says, "Sarpa bhramada vapihi jnanamastyeva tadrisham." So even so we need to deconstruct that a little bit. So when we are running, what has caused us to run away? It's not the snake, it's the knowledge of snake, and the knowledge of snake which has caused a fear in us, right? So because even when you are not seeing the snake, the knowledge and the fear are true.
Okay.
So Acharya's point is, so where is the effect of running is coming from the fear, which is true, and that fear is because of knowledge, which is also true. Knowledge being true doesn't mean knowledge is correct. But true is it is real. It is a real knowledge, but it is factually incorrect knowledge. That's a different aspect. So it can be factually incorrect, but it is still real. There can be further questions on, well, how did something that was not even there gave rise to this knowledge? So that's a question of what causes illusion, etc. But in terms of our categorization of reality, the result of running away is caused by fear, and that fear is true or real. So because I mean, later when we come back and realize that it was not
A snake, it's a rope.
snake, the counter is only to the presence of snake, but there is no counter to the presence of fear.
Right.
What I mean is, so you have, so you don't get to say that, no, I didn't have fear.
Right.
You can only say that there was no snake.
Right.
So the illusion is only at that level, but all that you are experiencing is still real. So by when we say external world, it is not just about what is out there in the physical world. It's also about your mental world. So for Acharya, when he said Jagat, anything that is other than the Atman, anything that's other than the Jivatman, is also as a category included in under the world or the external reality. So within those entities, you have dukkha, you have bhaya, all those are real experiences and therefore absolutely true.
Right. So going to the next question about this concept of Hari Sarvottamattva, this too has raised a lot of objections. So one could say, isn't it sectarian to think of one form of the Lord as being supreme? And also, why should one even worry about this idea about calling yourself either a Vaishnavite or a Shaiva? I mean, isn't being a good human more important for spiritual practices?
Okay. I think this is mostly coming from one kind of a view about what is the idea of Vishnu. So it is, well, you have hundreds of devatas and you are picking one and saying, okay, this person is supreme and therefore it is sectarian. That's perhaps the way or the reason for these kinds of concerns. I think by looking at this problem from two perspectives as to what is the idea of Vishnu in Sri Madhvacharya's view, and what's the basis to think about Vishnu as Sarvottama, the supreme being, in the drawing from the literature, the Vedic literature, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, would perhaps clarify what Acharya means by this. So, the concept of Vishnu is no different from the Upanishadic idea of Brahman, and that is the primary point Acharya is trying to say. When he is saying Brahman and the Vishnu are one and the same, the Upanishadic Brahman, essentially meaning that what we understand by the Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, the one who is essentially blissful and infinite and is full of pure knowledge, that idea is the Brahman, and that idea is Vishnu. So, Vishnu is essentially the and Acharya expands this further to say that infinite qualities, infinite good noble qualities raised to the infinite level individually is the idea of Bhagavan or Vishnu or Paramatma or Brahman, whatever we may call. In fact, Bhagavata Purana precisely articulates these three terms as that can be used in a way synonymously or referring to the same entity. Brahmeti, Paramatmeti, Bhagavaniti Shabdyate. Bhagavan, Brahma and Paramatma refer to the same idea, and that is Vishnu. So, Parama Atma is the supreme being, not Jivatma, but is someone who is Paramatma. Bhagavan is one who has some indicator qualities such as Aishwarya, the lordship, or Jnana, knowledge, Bala, power, Vairagya, the renunciation. So, all of these are present to an infinite level, and therefore he is called Bhagavan. And he is called Brahma because he is all pervasive, and he is not just in terms of time and space, but also in terms of qualities. And that is the very idea of Vishnu also. So, Vishnu, the term itself comes from Vishilru Vyaptau in Sanskrita. The root word refers to the pervasiveness, that he who is present everywhere in all dimensions. So, and Acharya uses this idea to elaborate on multiple other things, that the Paramatma, when he is all pervasive, it also means that he is Sarvantaryami, he is present, is the indweller, he is the one who is driving the activities of all of us and the entire universe. So, that Vishnu Tattva is just that. What we additionally also say is that it is the same Vishnu who has also taken multiple incarnations as Krishna, Rama, Matsya, Kurma, Vyasa, and all of these are Bhagavan Vishnu himself. So, it is not about one person that has been glorified, but it is that Upanishadic Brahman who is identified as Vishnu. And all these avatars are also infinite. All these avatars are also full of infinite qualities. They are no different from each other. Whether Krishna or Vyasa, they are one and the same. And the basis for this comes from the Bhagavad Gita itself, and also from many other texts. To quote a couple of points from the Bhagavad Gita, for example, Arjuna is identifying the Vishwarupa that he is seeing as Vishnu. Bhasastavograh pratapanti Vishnu. Hey Vishnu, I am seeing, I want to know more about you. Akyahiko bhavan ugra rupaha. So, why is this a ferocious form, and what exactly are you up to? And Krishna responds to that, etc. So, Arjuna recognizes him as Vishnu, and Krishna has been asked to show his own form, Darshaya Atmanam, and then he is showing this supreme form. So, Krishna and Vishnu are no different. And Krishna is also saying that people mistake me as born in some human form. Avajananti mam mudhaha manushim tanumashrikam. And he is saying, I am not that. So, I am the supreme being. So, the Parabrahma Tattva, the Vishnu Tattva, the Krishna Tattva, or all the forms of the Paramatman are one and the same. He is also clarifying, Mattah parataram na anyata kinchidasti dhananjaya. There is no other entity than me that is superior. So, and Acharya uses this to say that, Krishna is not negating any other entity. He is saying there is no other entity that is superior. So, I am superior, that necessarily means that there are inferior entities. So, I is Krishna referring to himself as Parabrahman. So, therefore, Krishna or Vishnu, the Brahman are one and the same. And there are multiple other references throughout the Bhagavad Gita. Aham Purushottamaha, in the 15th chapter, Krishna makes that point. So, and even in Mahabharata and such texts, we also see Alodya Sarvashastrani Vicharya cha Punah Punaha Idam Ekam Sunishpannam Dhyeyo Narayana Sada. So, if you look at all the texts and do a thorough analysis, what comes out is that Bhagavan Narayana has to be contemplated at every moment. So, therefore, this Vishnu Sarvottamatva is not a sectarian idea. It is coming from these texts that are considered the kind of gold standards to identify, understand the core of the Indian traditional thought, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, etc. So, on your second part of the question on shouldn't it be about good human behavior and being for spiritual practices and why Vaishnava and such things. So, there is one interesting discussion in the Bhagavad Gita Bhashya of Sri Madhvacharya, where there is this little controversial verse, if you look at it at the apparent level. Apichet suduracharaha bhajate mam ananya bhak sadhureva samantavya. If there is one very durachari, somebody who is not following any acceptable behavior, whether in social terms, moral terms, kind of a criminal or an antisocial element and bad behavior. But if he is Bhagavad Bhakta, then he is a sadhu. He must be seen as some noble guy.
So that's a discrepancy out
there. Correct. Yeah. So, and Sri Jaitirtha asked this question, the commentator on Madhva's Bhashya, at the beginning, well, what exactly is Krishna trying to say? So, to be a Vishnu Bhakta is perhaps, well, to wear some external symbols, and if you wear them and then following whatever you want, so you are a Vishnu Bhakta, so you should be treated as some good guy. So, is that what Krishna is saying? This is a question posed, and Sri Madhvacharya in his Bhashya says, well, this is a very particular reference to some of the devatas and the rishis. So, we see some devatas being cursed and falling from their devata position and being born, or it is some rishi due to some act have been cursed to do something else. So, even when they are doing these actions, because they are essentially having the bhakti in their hearts, they should not be considered as evil individuals, because they will come back to this at the right time once this curse is over. So, that is the point being made there. But what is interesting is what Madhvacharya follows that up with, and he says, if human beings are taking shelter under this verse and are trying to protect themselves with the mere external Vishnu Bhakti, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning also, external symbols are also important, but if it is just about them and are fundamentally duracharis, then so they have to be termed dambhikatvena anumeyaha, that they are hypocrites, that they are showing this Vishnu Bhakti outwardly and they are not Vishnu Bhaktas in the true sense. Well, what do you mean by that, in the true sense Vishnu Bhakti? And Acharya quotes an important section from the Vishnu Purana. It's called Yama Geeta, where Yama is teaching the Yamadutas as to who should be brought to Naraka and who should not be. And he's saying, don't bring Vaishnavas here. So then they ask, okay, how should we identify who a Vaishnava is? So there Yama gives a detailed list as to who should be identified as Vaishnava and who are not. And Madhvacharya quotes that to say, one of the verses there is, Sa Shathamati Rupayati Yo Artha Trishnam Tam Adhamacheshtam Avaihi Nasya Bhaktam. Don't consider that guy as a Vishnu Bhakta who is behind mere material progress and is looking after, is very greedy, is excessively indulging in money, artha trishna, and is shathamati, who says one thing, does the other. There is this hypocrisy in his behavior. So, just as an example, don't consider him as a bhakta. He is not a Vishnu bhakta. So, basically, there are these tools that primarily indicate that it is all about primarily good behavior that fundamentally characterize you to be eligible to Vishnu bhakti to start with. Of course, then there are other philosophical and religious and ritualistic aspects that have to be integrated into this to engage in next order pursuits. But so therefore, Vishnu bhakti is not decoupled from the basic human behavior. So it's an incorrect dichotomy to say that human behavior or the good human behavior, good moral standards has nothing to do with Vaishnavata, which is more just about the symbols, etc. No. So of course symbols are important, but this is even at the more fundamental level.
Right. So now going to the next tenet that says that every soul is dependent on Narayana. So if that be the case, why would we need a code of conduct? And why should one even follow any course of action? Since everything is anyhow dependent on the Supreme, on the Lord, why do anything?
Okay. This is a little involved technical debate, so or a discussion. I'll try to make it a little kind of relatable through a few analogies. So perhaps the message will be clearer, I suppose. So one way to look at it, I mean, when we give examples, we're obviously diluting the matter a little bit, but it should perhaps convey the idea. So it's like the electricity. So all these instruments that we have are dependent on the electricity. That doesn't mean that the instruments have no identity or existence or individuality of their own. The fan rotates and the light illuminates. So those are two different expressions that those objects are performing, but they are all carrying electricity, and without electricity they don't function. So to say that they are dependent on electricity doesn't mean that you don't need to operate or you don't need to work on the capabilities that you have. So every individual has an individual capability or a distinct capability, but they can't function without the power or the impelling drive that the Lord can give. I mean, let me take a couple of other examples. You have a few, let's say, student entrepreneurs. They need to set up something. They don't have resources. So as an educational experiment or as an internship experiment, there will be one, an employer or the person who is taking them as interns, giving them, okay, I'll give you these resources. You think of an idea, implement something, and come back. Now, these interns are dependent on the person to provide them the resources. Okay. They can't do on their own. But that does not take away the fact that they have their own intelligence, they have their own choices to make, even when there is resource. When the resources, without the resources, they can't use that. So it is, whether the electricity that is powering these instruments or the resources powering the individuals, let's say, and you can abstract that out further and further. So one is the resource. Then you have a human body. The human body may not be functioning if it is affected by some disease, and let's say the doctors correct some illness there. So without the body being addressed of its problems, the individual cannot make a move. So that doesn't. So he's dependent on the body. That doesn't mean that there is no individuality or the choice for the person. So if you abstract that out further and further, so you get to a point where there is something called an essential feature of an individual. That's the swabhava, or the very nature of an individual. So for that nature to operate, you need all the other resources. So you need the power, you need the blessings, you need the instruments, and all of those are provided by the Lord. So the Lord being both the indweller to make the person move,
Like the impelling force
like the
within.
impelling force within, and is also the person who provides you with the appropriate resources to make use of your essential capability, is in this way the controller. But that does not take away from the fact that you have an individuality of your own.
So there is some amount of free will
Ha.
in the
The word free will is a little, I mean, the reason why I'm a little hesitant to use that is the word freedom has two different connotations. It can be seen as a binary, that you're either free or you're not free. Or it can be seen as a continuum, that you're free within these constraints.
okay.
Right? Some argue that freedom must be seen as a binary. So if you are free, you must be absolutely free. Putting any constraints takes the freedom away by definition, is one view. And if you take that view, then we are not free. I mean, there cannot be a second free person than the Lord. I mean, that's a logical contradiction. I mean, the absolute freedom, if there are two individuals with absolute freedom, and let's say one wants to defeat the other,
Right.
how does it work? It cannot. So it has to be one person as the absolute free individual. But if you look at it as a gradation, that okay, you're free within these constraints, then there is some freedom. You're free, let's say, so if you look at this from a hierarchical perspective, after Bhagavan, some Mahalakshmi, so she has freedom to a much greater extent. Then you have the Devatas, then you have the Rishis, so the freedom
Dwindles. Right.
The constraints increase because our capability to control the resources
Is
come down
less, yes.
less and less. So within that sense, if you want to call that free will, of course, fine. But if we take the first definition of absolute freedom,
Right.
there isn't.
Got it.
Yeah.
So the next one is related again, because all these tenets are again related to each other. What about the tenet that says souls have a natural hierarchy? This Taratamya concept has also been called discriminatory. How would you respond to that?
Taratamya and discriminatory, both terms need to be
Sure.
deconstructed or explored a little bit. So Taratamya basically means the superior and the inferior kind of order, the ordered structure within a set, right? So you have some individuals performing, let's say, practicing some art form. So you have one who does better, then the best, and then good. So good, better, best, the terms that we use in English, where you have a comparative degree and a superlative degree. In Sanskrita, we have tarap and tamap as the two pratyayas, and the taratamya is basically coming from that. So let's say you are looking at something that is pure. Okay, so if something is pure, you call it shuddha. It's even purer, you call it shuddhatara. And it's purest, then you call it shuddhatama. So shuddha, shuddhatara, shuddhatama. Pavitra, pavitratara, pavitratama. So auspicious and more auspicious and most auspicious. So this more, most that we use in English,
Okay.
the Sanskrita is tara and tama. Tarap and tamap are the pratyayas. So taratamya is basically talking about that hierarchy that's internally present. Even the word discrimination inherently is not a bad word. It has become so. So I'll take it as a bad
Negative,
word,
right.
in the negative connotation. Because I mean, discrimination is also referring to some kind of discerning capability.
Yes,
So viveka, in that sense, it has a positive
Yes.
connotation. But if you take discrimination as an unfair treatment
Right.
for equals, then it is a wrong thing. What Acharya is saying through the idea of Taratamya is not to, he's not prescribing Taratamya, he is describing Taratamya. They're completely two different things. So he's not saying that you show for people who are equal a kind of a discriminatory behavior towards them. What he's saying, which I mean, though I'm not a great fan of trying to compare this with contemporary political debates, but sometimes it may be helpful because, so what we are trying to say is equity essentially assumes inequality.
Right.
Right? I mean, if there is no inequality, why should anyone talk about equity to begin with? I mean, the idea of equity is to say that, see, because people are at different levels, you have to treat them in different ways so that they come to a level playing field, and then they are given, quote unquote, equal opportunities in that sense.
Right.
And this idea of taratamya, in a way, is no different from this. So what this is basically saying is that, you know, individuals come with different strengths and weaknesses. They have different capabilities, and their inherent nature is hierarchical. So it would be incorrect to prescribe the same mode and the same practices, same approach to everyone, because that would be discriminatory. So contrary to recognizing taratamya, if you are blind to the reality of taratamya, that would make it discriminatory. Giving equal opportunities without recognizing the differing capabilities reinforces inequality. I mean, that's how the contemporary debate is also about, right?
Yes.
So therefore, what Acharya was basically trying to suggest is that, you know, inherent differences cannot be ignored, and that's a reality. And therefore, every individual, depending on their familial background, depending on their resources, they have different sadhana marga.
Swabhava also.
Swabhava also. So their swabhava would be different, their resources would be different, their ecosystem would be different. So for each of them, therefore you have this diversity. You know, somebody would be performing whatever is the familial profession, and that is still considered the swadharma. And in fact, Acharya calls the real dharma is just to follow your swadharma with Vishnu Bhakti. You know, swavihita vritya bhaktya bhagavad aradhanameva paramo dharma. And he says this is the essence of the Bhagavad Gita teaching. So you're saying something to Arjuna because he is in that position, and you don't prescribe the same thing to someone else. So recognizing this hierarchy and the distinction can be argued to be a more equitable proposition to make, and therefore this is not discriminatory in that sense of the term.
It would be more personalized.
Correct, exactly.
The present
Customized,
data.
personalized, exactly,
Right.
for one's own swabhava.
Right.
So therefore, that requires a recognition of hierarchy.
Right.
And I mean, from a more pragmatic sense, hierarchy is the reality. We know that. We can have different policy solutions to make that less oppressive, less exploitative for whatever reasons, but that doesn't make the reality of hierarchy to go away.
Right.
So hierarchy is being described as a reality, but one clarification before I take your next question is Acharya's hierarchy is not so much about human beings. He was more or less saying that human beings are mostly in the same category. Evam saman rajivastu vishesho devatadishu. The devatas, you know, for example, Vayudeva, then say Indra, then Agni, there is an internal hierarchy. And then when it comes to the human beings, so you have come down significantly to one other layer. Within that, there may be minor hierarchy. So the core point is not about the hierarchy there. It's the hierarchy of the devatas and the asuras.
Asuras.
I mean, to tie it back to our Mahabharata discussion, you are given the same resources in a way to Kauravas and Pandavas.
Correct.
And how they operate and how these guys operate show an inner difference and the hierarchy of their priorities to indicate that someone is a devata swabhava, of a much higher devata swabhava, a lower devata swabhava, or a higher demonic or the asuric swabhava.
Right.
So that is the hierarchy that Acharya is primarily focusing on. So it may be incorrect to extrapolate that and to say that, you know, he's talking about hierarchy
At the human level.
At the human level to a large extent.
Right.
Yeah.
So this sort of goes to a point you had made earlier about moksha, individual moksha. So the next tenet was about experiencing one's own internal bliss as being moksha. So would this mean that whatever we experience in the form of unhappiness or sorrow is then false?
Okay. So moksha is the
Inner bliss.
inner bliss,
Yes.
which is part of the very nature of the
Swabhava.
individual. Correct. So individual swabhava, or the nature of that individual. So anything else that we are experiencing, so this connects to our earlier discussion on what is reality. No, the
Yes.
world being real,
Yeah,
right? So is it false then what we are experiencing? So Sri Jayatirtha provides a very beautiful summary of this problem and the approach of Sri Madhvacharya school on this question. I mean, I'm paraphrasing it and probably giving a simpler example to appreciate. Let's say you're a student looking for the exam results, and the results are out, and you're searching for your hall ticket number, and you put some wrong number, and you find some result there, and that is less than what you have expected. Then you feel sad about it. Is that feeling of sadness true, real, false? So how do we categorize that? So the way Sri Jayatirtha argues is that it's basically something that's not yours. So that result is not yours. You have put in a wrong number, but you have owned that up wrongly, and you're experiencing the result of that wrong ownership. So the problem lies in this wrong ownership. Because of that wrong ownership, you have to experience the consequence.
Okay.
So you have wrongly identified yourself.
This comes under inaccuracy, the incorrectness.
Correct. So you have wrongly identified the an entity that doesn't belong to you as yours, and have inflated or superimposed the impacts that come because of that as yours. I mean, to give apologies for that, but a morbid example, there's some a road traffic accident or a plane crash or whatever, and you assume that somebody known to you is actually in that, and then recognize that no. So then the suffering or the pain that you experience for that bit, was it false or real? So the way Sri Jayatirtha argues is that, so you have superimposed that which was not yours. Because of that, you had an experience, and that experience is true.
Okay.
So the experience is true, but it was due to a wrong understanding of what you are and what you are not.
Right.
So when you separate yourself from the manas, the samsara, all these things, basically philosophically the concept used is that of abhimana, and what Krishna argues as nirmamatva and nirahankara. So
Abhimana is attachment.
Abhimana is attachment. So you're basically attaching to things that you actually don't own. And for all the things that are happening there, you're feeling the problem. So the manas is not you. So all the things that are happening are at the manas level. And therefore, once you have a greater viveka, the discerning capability to know what you are and what you are not, then this moves away, or this does not affect you anymore, what is happening at the mind level, then all these sufferings won't be yours. And that is moksha. Therefore, your inner nature is blissful, but unfortunately, you have assumed other things that you are not yours as yours, and therefore you are experiencing it. So once that abhimana is addressed, then the pain and the sufferings get addressed. So this is not incorrect. I mean, this is not false, but is incorrect.
Okay.
It's a wrong understanding, but a real understanding. It's a wrong suffering. You are feeling the pain for a wrong reason. Once you understand that reason, then your pain vanishes.
So the next related, that's why I brought it to the level of, we are talking about moksha. So pure bhakti is the sadhana or a tool for moksha, right? So what about the other important means like the karma, jnana, yoga? Where does that fit in?
Karma, jnana and bhakti are usually seen as one unit in Madhvacharya's philosophy. In the sense, karma is required at two levels. One is to cleanse one's mind. So all the rituals, all the swadharma, the practices that we do on a day-to-day basis is basically to cleanse our antahkarana, our manas. So the karma is required to make your mind pure. It is in that mind that the knowledge can appear, or the wisdom, the impressions through the shastras can appear. So when the mind is imprinted with the greatness of the Lord, which is the knowledge that you get, then there is an attachment that comes naturally to it. So karma is the first step in a way. Jnana, that goes hand in hand, makes the mind mature to get that bhakti in it. So while bhakti is the primary or the real tool for pleasing the Lord or for moksha through his blessings, the bhakti is possible through jnana and karma. Krishna himself says this, naham vedaihi na tapasa na danena na chejjaya shakya evam vidho drashtum drishtavanasi mam yatha bhaktya tu ananyaya shakyaha aham evam vidhorchana. Only with bhakti you can visualize me the way in which you have seen the Vishwarupa. It is not possible to see by mere dana, tapasya or yajna, any of the forms, if there is no bhakti element in it. So bhakti element is the primary requirement. So bhakti, jnana and karma are in this way seen as one.
Okay.
The yoga marga is also, because Krishna is more or less decisively saying that there is no other alternative than bhakti. So bhakti has to be there even in the yoga marga. So when yoga is about, say, ashtanga yoga sadhana or the the dhyana, dharana, samadhi, that kind of yoga sadhana, even there bhakti is required. The difference between these two approaches, and Acharya argues that both are legitimate paths. The yoga is more of these inner control related sadhana, whereas bhakti is more of shravana, manana, dhyana, that tool or that path. So that doesn't mean that you don't need the inner control in the bhakti marga, or that you don't need shravana manana in yoga marga. It is more of the balance or the prioritization. What do you do more? So that makes it more of the yoga marga or the bhakti marga. But bhakti is the primary tool across these.
Seems like a tall order. So how can all of them be achieved in one lifetime? That's one thing. And I guess you sort of touched upon it, but has not bhakti been looked down upon as rather unscholarly?
Right. So I think, let me take the first one, second one first.
Okay.
So that's precisely what I'm trying to get at. This is due to a very significant misconception of what bhakti is.
Right.
Including to using this in contemporary political discourse. The term bhakta or bhakti has been used to demean a person as not having knowledge.
Right.
So it's an unscholarly so it's a bad translation or an understanding of the term bhakti. So that is perhaps leading to these confusions also. So as I said, bhakti in Madhvacharya's frame is jnana plus attachment. So it's surely not unscholarly. Without scholarship, there is no bhakti by definition. So that's the definitional problem. The first question on isn't it a tall order problem? Of course, yes. And therefore, Krishna himself says, bahunam janmanam ante Jnanavan mam prapadyate. So it is a and that's the beauty of the Indian knowledge systems, right? I mean, we talk about sadhana not in terms of hours or days, and our timelines are multiple janmas. So this is not to be can be achieved in a very short span with specific targets in hours or days or months. So it's about multiple janmas. So keeping that long-term view in mind, and the steps that are required to cleanse our mind towards that process is perhaps what makes it pragmatic and practical. It is also would be interesting to actually see that this is also an indication or an indicator of the taratamya that we discussed earlier. That because of this reason, some don't even pursue. Oh, this is a tall order and we can't do this. And some say, well, it may not be possible in one janma. I'll take multiple janmas but still do this. And some say, no, I'll put in as much effort as I can within this janma and probably take that to the next steps later. So the amount of commitment that we show, irrespective of the results that we get, is also a reflection of our own swabhava and therefore the taratamya.
Okay, right,
so therefore, so the tall order problem is a good thing as a test that gives a better distribution in results.
So touching upon the epistemological tools for a bit, you had mentioned that there are three pramanas. There is the Pratyaksha, which is perception, there is Anumana, which is logic, and there is Agama, which is the text. In the last episode, you had mentioned that Acharya places Anubhava as being the highest form of the pramana. So is Anubhava higher than even all these three, that is Pratyaksha, Anumana and Agama? Is it higher than these three?
No. Okay. So Anubhava is a type of Pratyaksha.
Okay.
So Pratyaksha is of two types, external Pratyaksha and internal Pratyaksha. So in fact, Swadrikcha Anubhava Smritaha, a kind of self-aware, a knowledge that is self-aware, that is the Anubhava. So you look at an external object and you get to know something, and then you know about that knowledge itself. That is the experience. So the experience is is a kind of a second order knowledge that we get about myself, about my knowledge, about my happiness, about my ignorance. So that is the Anubhava. So the reason why Anubhava was kept at that very high level is that Pratyaksha, Anumana or Agama, they all three give you knowledge, but Anubhava sees that very knowledge and interprets that. Well, I know this, I don't know this, and what I know is valid, and that has to be reconciled with what I am, which is also known to me. So experience is the self-knowledge in a way. It is called Swadrik, the knowledge that sees itself and the knowledge which is not different from myself.
Okay.
That is the Anubhava. That Anubhava is also a form of Pratyaksha.
Okay.
Just that it is not the external Pratyaksha, it's not through external sense organs, but it is the inner Pratyaksha.
Okay.
And therefore it is put at the higher level, but it is a type of Pratyaksha only.
The second comment you had made in the previous episode is you had said that in our sacred knowledge system, logic is not given undue emphasis. So it seems rather counterintuitive in the present day, logic not being given emphasis.
Right. Right. I mean, as you said, it's not given undue importance.
Okay.
So there are all three have their own place. Pratyaksha for so the entities that we can directly cognize from our sense organs, Pratyaksha becomes the most important tool, independent of what the texts may say.
Okay.
Right? I mean, so this is a Pratyaksha domain. In fact, especially when it comes to the inner Pratyaksha, it is exclusively in the domain of our Anubhava. And Acharya goes, as you asked in your last question also, Acharya goes on to say that nacha anubhava virodhe agamasya pramanyam. Even the texts don't carry any weight or any validity if they are contradicting my very experience. And my experience here doesn't mean, just my opinion or my feeling, not that kind of an experience. It's an experience about who I am. So let's say I'm hungry, and some texts say, no, you're not hungry now. I mean, that's cannot be the case. I mean, I'm hungry, I need, or I'm thirsty. So that is the experiential level. So pratyaksha, whether it is of the external world, and if you are true that, if you are sure that the sense organs are working fine, then what we perceive through the pratyaksha is of highest validity, and we don't need to check with agama or anumana. Similarly, the agama, when it comes to the atindriya world, the world of dharma, paramatma, so the ideas,
sensory,
correct, beyond our sensory realm. So those ideas, the atindriya vishayas, are to be known exclusively through the agamas or the shastras. So there, what our pratyaksha says does not matter, unless it is talking about the ideas that are accessible to our pratyaksha. So if it says that no, you don't have the suffering, well, I am suffering. So it can't be reconciled in that way. So the agama has its role or scope, jurisdiction. The pratyaksha has its jurisdiction. The anumana, I mean, if we have to appreciate how anumana functions. Anumana is looking at something and inferring some other thing. So I mean, we probably have given too much currency to the word logic, but if we appreciate what exactly logic does, is to see something and infer.
Can you give an example to make this a little more relatable?
So you mean for
like
the
logic?
Yes. So so logic is, let's say, I mean, take a medical science or a general practice example. So you do a blood test, you get some values. Because of those values, you imply or infer what may have happened in the human body in real terms. So you look at a hemoglobin value, it says, let's say 12 or 13, then you imply that the hemoglobin levels are fine, right? You can't see the hemoglobin directly, but you have made multiple observations where you know the hemoglobin level through some other metric, and then you have tested it through a different test, and then you have made a mapping that wherever I get this number, this must be the hemoglobin value. So that is the logic that you have built. But let's say you go as a patient and you are experiencing weakness, and there is pallor, there is swollen limbs, all classical symptoms that you can directly visualize, both as a patient experience and as a doctor directly see that, okay, there is surely something is wrong with the hemoglobin value in this person. But you do a test and you get some value. Then that is contradicting. Then, given that you can actually experience and feel and see, you would give higher weightage there and say that, okay, this is probably a wrong result. Why don't we redo the test here? Right. So the point is, the logic basically operates by repeated observations and abstracting out a correlation, and then say, wherever I see this, this must be the case. So logic is not an independent tool. It only provides you an explanation for a mechanism to link two objects, link two entities, link two observations, link two factors. So it's a kind of an explanation for a why. Why something is happening, okay, because of this. Then you go further, why that, but at some point in time, you actually end up saying, no, this is what it is. Right. So pratyaksha, or what you see from agama, forms the basis for formulating any logic. Okay. Therefore, you can't use a logic in an isolated sense to contradict what the pratyaksha is telling you. Got it. That's all we meant by saying not undue emphasis. on Anumana.
So,
And the word Anumana, interesting. Anu is anusritya, that is to follow something. Mana is a pramana. So it's a pramana which follows Pratyaksha or Agama. That's why it's called an Anumana. It's a subservient. It is to be used to reinforce something,
right.
And cannot contradict what has been established by Pratyaksha or Agama.
So one final question. So you had mentioned the ninth tenet to be words, only words, and all words essentially primarily refer to Narayana. So how does this work? We hear that words alone are incapable of referring to the truth, and especially that the Lord is clearly beyond words and can only be experienced, can only be an anubhava. So how does that work? And essentially, second thing it said, all words, right? So how can even negative words be associated with the Lord? Like you have adharma, ajnana, such negative words. So how can they be associated with the Lord?
Okay. So, Vedaischa sarvair ahameva vedyaha is what Krishna says. So, again from the Bhagavad Gita, that every, the entire Vedic corpus is talking about, is Krishna's point. And there are 2-3 things that Sri Madhvacharya derives from this. One, as we have been seeing, the way to appreciate the Lord is through the texts. And the Lord is full of infinite qualities. And every word talks about a quality, at least one quality. So therefore, when you have infinite words talking about at least individually infinite, one quality each, there are infinite qualities that are referring to the Lord's greatness. But what happens if it is a negative word, or if it is talking about a flaw? And Acharya uses this a very new idea of I would say an interesting contribution to the whole linguistics in general. He says a word carries 2 layers of meanings. One, so let's say when you use the word, you are a loser, or you are a winner. So these 2 words, Acharya says, refer to the individual who directly has that defeat or win with the person, or the one who controls the person. So for example, when an Indian team goes and wins or loses a tournament, you say India won or lost. I mean, India hasn't won or lost anything as a country, but you have some individuals who are working for a particular entity, in this case a country. So when they win, we call that the country has won. Or we sometimes may represent that through the president, the prime minister, or the government, and say, and give that trophy to the president or the prime minister. They haven't participated there or won, but we say, well, you are the winner. So Acharya uses this usages to draw the idea that a word refers not only to the person who is directly affected by it, but also refers to the person who controls those attributes. So when you use the word dukkhi or ajnani or ajnana, so these negative qualities, they also refer to the Lord, not in the sense that he is affected by it, but he is the controller of it. So he is called baddha. He is bound. So he is not bound by the factors in this samsara, but he is the one who causes the binding to the individuals, and therefore he is known by the term as baddha. He is known as dukkhi, not because he is suffering, he is not having dukkha, but he has control over the dukkha of others. Therefore, even the negative terms have a way to refer to the Lord without affecting him directly through the first level meaning of those words. So every word refers to, if it is a positive word, refers to the quality in the Lord by carrying the infinite capacity that the word can have. So when you say the word Ananda, it means infinite Ananda to the Lord. When you use the word Dukkha, it says is the one who controls Dukkha. So in that sense, every word is talking about one or the other good quality of the Lord.
Lots of things were discussed, lots of new things were explained and revealed in this session. So maybe it will help if I were to sort of summarize it, so with some key takeaways if possible for our audience. So the way I understand is there is individual identity or svabhavavada is different. So as in every individual has an identity of their own, and the spiritual journey is really about recognizing that of every individual. Is the recognition and realizing of that individuality. And here we want to clarify in this discussion that when we refer to individualism, individuality, we are not talking about it in terms of modern connotations of the term, which is sort of selfishness, which is associated with selfishness. And our spiritual journey is really about realizing our own self and the dependence on the Lord. And secondly, there's this concept of Vaishnava Tattva or Vishnu Bhakti, and it's not really a mere religious identity, that it is a far more comprehensive characterization of good human behavior, moral values, spiritual growth and devotion. It's essentially about being an ethical human. Basically, that's what it is. And thirdly is our primary duty or swadharma is about how we align our life goals and duties as Bhagvat Puja. And it's not mere ritualism, although ritualism also has its certainly has its merit. But in the case that we have discussed here, it's really about staying connected, in the sense that our life purpose is connected to the performance of bhakti and puja. It's connected and aligned in that form. And finally, from all the examples that you've quoted throughout our discussion, and from what Sri Madhvacharya also has posited to us through his works, that Bhagavad Gita really has the explanation for almost everything that comes, be it in philosophical debates or the Sanatana thought. And it is essentially the theory for everything, if you can say that, that one needs to really realize one's life goals, which is really about Purushartha, which is mentioned, encapsulated in the Bhagavad Gita. So, thank you so much, Srinidhi ji.
Thank you very
so
much.
much for joining us in this episode.
And
And please do stay tuned in. We'll have the third in this tripartite series on Sri Madhvacharya's Tattvavada School of Vedanta. In the next episode, we'll be going a little deeper into some of the aspects of Madhvacharya's approach and how it has a relevant application in modern times in terms of education, in terms of academic rigor, research, and we'll be looking at some of these aspects in our next episode. Dhanyavad.
Namaste.